So the first time I heard the word Leitkultur, I had absolutely no idea what people were talking about. I remember hearing it on the news a few years ago, and there was some sort of like political debate on TV, and this word, Leitkultur, kept coming up again and again. And because my German wasn't that great at the time, I did what I always did back then, which was like try to work out the meaning of individual words. And so like light and culture, I knew what that meant, culture, basically. But I wasn't really too sure what light meant in this context. I knew the word light, lighter as in team leader, as in leader. So I thought maybe it was something like leading a culture or dominant culture. But I wasn't really sure, so I decided to look it up. And to be honest, I wasn't really much the wiser after having looked it up, because every explanation seemed to be slightly different. Every politician seemed to use the word differently, and it just seemed to come up a lot every time there was a debate about immigration or integration. And it was just like one of those words where for me, it felt like everybody in Germany already understood this term. They knew what it meant, except for me. And so, eventually I really decided to sit down and look into this properly. The problem that I found is that every explanation, it seems to start from a different place. So some people said Leitkultur was simply about respecting the constitution and democracy and the rule of law. And others were talking about speaking German and understanding German history and adapting to German society. And I remember thinking wait a minute, those aren't really the same thing. Those are two separate things. And so one is basically just talking about the rules and laws and institutions. And the other is trying to talk about language and culture and social norms, which are just way more subjective and more open to interpretation. And those are two different conversations, which I don't think I really fully appreciated before looking into this. Because if you'd asked me 10 years ago, what does it mean to integrate into Germany, I probably would have just given a pretty simple answer learn German, get a job, follow the rules, try not to annoy your neighbors. That was pretty much my understanding of it. But the longer I've lived here, the more I've realized that every country has certain expectations that are not written down anywhere. I mean, of course they do. These unwritten rules. Nobody hands you a book when you arrive. It's not like, you get an employee handbook or corporate commandments like when you start a job. You just slowly pick them up over time. The word itself is actually much, much newer than I expected. I thought it was pretty antiquated, but it was actually popularized only in the 90s by political scientist Bassem Tibi. His idea was not really about sausages and sauerkraut or Oktoberfest or Christmas markets. At least as far as I can tell, he was just asking whether a diverse society needs a shared set of values that everybody can recognize. Things like democracy, freedom of speech, equality before the law itself, the rule of law. That was, at least as far as I can tell, that was his version of Leitkultur, and he does seem to be the one that actually coined this term and created this concept. But the thing is that every country has something like this. I wouldn't say this is really a German thing. And so the more I read about it, the more I realized that I was probably asking the wrong question, because I kept asking, what does Leitkultur mean? What do Germans think when they hear this word? What does it actually mean? But I think the more interesting question is, why does Germany even have a word like this? Why did Bassem Tibi feel the need to create this concept? Because if you think about it, every country does have these unwritten rules. It's not controversial to say. When I was growing up in England, nobody ever sat me down and said, this is British culture. Nobody handed me a list of values and said, this is how British people behave. You just grew up around it. Your teachers, your parents, your siblings, your peers. It's just kind of unconsciously you just imbibe it, and you grow up thinking that's just how things are. You grow up thinking that's normal. And I would say that's true pretty much everywhere. Like if you move to Japan, there would be things that people expect from you. If you move to France or Italy or the US, it's the same kind of thing. So I don't think that Germany is unusual because it has a shared culture. Maybe it's unusual because, it's got this specific term for it, which is actually pretty new. And I do wonder if part of the reason is simply the way that Germany developed, because Germany hasn't been one country for a very long time. It's actually pretty new. It used to just be made up of like lots of different kingdoms and regions. And even today, these regional identities are really very strong. Like if you spend any time here, you'll know that a Bavarian and someone from Hamburg or like northern Germany, they don't actually have all that much in common. So maybe that's why this becomes such a difficult conversation, because if you're going to say there's like one guiding culture, whose culture are we actually talking about here? And maybe that's like one of the reasons why I found this debate so interesting, because, the more I think about it, it's not that different to the UK or Britain, because, we talk about British culture as though it's one obvious thing. But then you spend 5 minutes talking to someone from Scotland or Wales, and you realize it's not that simple either. There isn't just one single story that everybody agrees on. Depending on who you ask, British culture can sometimes just look like English culture with a different label. And I know that some of you have criticized me for talking about the UK and Britain instead of, certain commenters just get very sensitive when talking about these cultural differences. And they just reject the idea of the UK or Britain and basically say that this is not a valid concept. And look, I think this is probably true of lots of countries. One thing that did really confuse me in relation to Leitkultur was that in Bassem Tubi's version, it seems to be just another way of saying these, saying things like these basic rules that hold society together, like democracy and the constitution, equality before the law, that kind of thing. So it really is very basic. And I mean, is it really culture? I mean, I suppose it is. That is at least structurally part of the culture, like on a structural level, but I'm not sure it's enough. And so then I would read some other articles, and they were then talking about, something quite different. They were really getting more specific and talking about the German language and understanding German history and social norms and everyday behavior, things that aren't written down anywhere, but, that most Germans probably would recognize as being integral to the culture here. And I just think this is where the whole debate, it starts to get quite interesting, because laws, are relatively easy. They're written down. You can read them. It's very clear. When somebody's not followed them or not respected them. But culture is obviously a bit different because nobody can really point to it. It's like ephemeral. It's like water. It's there. It's the way people queue. It's how people disagree with each other. It's how people dress or how they speak to strangers. Or really, it's the things that people just assume without necessarily saying them out loud. People are not thinking specifically about them, which is maybe why this then gets very uncomfortable when you try to do that. So living abroad has really made me realize, that you only really notice your own culture once you've left it. Like growing up in England, I never really spent any time thinking about British culture. It just felt normal, like it was just, it was just there. But after living in Germany, I really started noticing all these little assumptions that I brought with me. Things that I just thought were really common sense, like everybody knows this. Like apologizing and saying sorry even when you haven't actually done anything wrong, or assuming that politeness means being indirect, or just falling into an orderly queue when there's nobody organizing it. These are not universal. These were normal for me because of where I grew up. Like that's really that's really what culture is. And so maybe the real question isn't really about Leitkultur in Germany, because I think every country has something like this. I think maybe the really difficult part is trying to express it or trying to describe what it actually is. Because the moment you try to do that, the moment you try to put culture into words, there's always someone who's just going to say, well, that's not my experience. That's not how I see it. And because Germany is such a culturally rich and diverse country, it's not an easy thing to talk about. Like, never mind about East versus West or North and South. I mean, you have rivalry between cities that are just a few kilometers apart, like Frankfurt and Offenbach. So what are your thoughts on this? I would love it if we could really discuss these things in a civil and unemotional way without spiraling into political madness. Like, I don't know if it's the internet, because I can have these discussions with friends and colleagues, and we might disagree on certain points, but it doesn't have to get personal or like hysterical. It would just be really great if we could have a normal discussion in the digital realm. Anyway, if you found this interesting, I would love to know your thoughts. I'm expanding. Yes, that's right. I have started a second channel, which is completely auf Deutsch, completely in German. So if you want to hear my ramblings in heavily accented German, then check that out. I will leave a link in the description below. Other than that, take care. Have a good day. And bye. Ade. Tschüss.